1. And welcome to everybody, and particularly to our 2 fabulous candidates. Thank you to Ed and Leila for giving us your time this evening, and thank you to the audience for joining us. I'm going to take us through a little bit of the structure of how this is going to work. So thank you all for joining the Diversity and Equality Hustings event. This is hosted tonight by the West Midlands Diversity and Equality Committee and Liberal Democrat headquarters. So now this, there have been many hustings, but this is not going to be a traditional one. There will be no opening or closing statements other than from yours truly. And what we've done actually, in order to try and keep this something that is directly between the candidates and the people that one of you is going to go forward and represent, is we've lined up delegates from across every single campaign group we could lay our hands on and their affiliated organizations. And we've asked them to put their burning questions to you. So the groups that are involved in tonight's activities are the Young Liberals, the Racial Diversity Campaign, LGBT plus LD, the Chinese Liberal Democrats, LDCRE, Lib Dem Women, Lib Dem Muslim Forum, and the Lib Dem Black Action Group. Now, all the questions were pre-selected, but we didn't share them with you because we're like that. And we thought that it would just be better if we could get, your opinion on them as they came, because it is so much better than having, and you didn't need to prepare for this because you're both absolutely fabulous. So what I would like the audience to think about is, please, those of you that are following us, please tweet at hashtag WMLibDems or comment on YouTube to share your thoughts on what the candidates have to say. So, right, let's just get started. So I'm going to introduce the person with the question. I'm going to give both of you about 3 or 4 minutes each to answer the questions, and then I'm going to see how it goes after that, and maybe let the delegate talk to you again, and maybe not. We're just going to kind of try and keep it interesting and see how that goes. Our first fabulous delegate is Catherine Macy, who's from the Young Liberals. And Catherine, you have a question.
Yes, hello. So the question that the Young Liberals would really like to know is, how would you sell the party to first-time voters?
I didn't hear that, I'm afraid.
How would you sell the party to a first-time voter? Either of you, there is no order of precedence. Either of you could answer.
Okay, I'll go. So first of all, thank you, Catherine, for your question. And if I recognise you, Catherine, you are the person who brought the Young Carers motion to conference, if I'm right. And the first thing I'd say is that, if that's true, but either way, we have some incredible input that we need from young people in politics right now. And what I keep hearing, whenever I'm traveling around in my role as education spokesperson, is young people crying out for change in this country. They recognize the injustices that are happening all around them right now. There are huge injustices happening literally this week with A-levels that I'm fighting tooth and nail. And the way that young people are going to be affected by this coronavirus crisis actually has to be a mantle that we are front and center of as Liberal Democrats, and that is what I'm absolutely intent to do. There are going to be a lot of first-time voters who are young, who are going to be, we're going to be wanting to attract to us as Lib Dems. We've got the Senedd elections and the Holyrood elections. 16, 17-year-olds are going to be able to vote in those countries. And in England, we've got council elections as well. And what we have to present to them is an unabashedly positive, liberal vision for Britain, where we are really clear about who we are, about how we believe that the world needs to change, about how injustices in inequality, how we make sure that we are talking about the issues that young people really care about. The 3 E's of my campaign are education, the environment, and the economy. And education, well, what better way of describing why we're liberals than investing in the next generation? We also need to recognize that in the past, we haven't done so well with this. We've lost a lot of trust with young people, particularly over tuition fees. And I keep hearing it. Unfortunately, it's still true in university campuses that people don't vote Lib Dem because of that. We have to re-attract those voters with really, really bold policy on education. But the issue that comes top of the list whenever I listen to a lot of young people is the environment. You know, the Friday Strikes for Futures, when I was surrounded by thousands of young people in Oxford, and they made me promise, and I did it willingly, saying that I would do whatever I could to ensure that their voices were heard. I went back to Parliament. I called the first debate on the floor of the House on climate change in 2.5 years, in the midst of what was happening with Brexit. I then worked cross-party to bring Greta Thunberg to Parliament to address parliamentarians and really raise the temperature on this issue. What young people, I think, want to see from the Liberal Democrats is that we get it. We get those huge issues. We are on your side, and we are as motivated as you to create that more equal, fair, free society that we stand for as Liberal Democrats.
Thank you. Ed?
I talk about the greener economy, fairer society, and more caring country, which is my platform in this campaign, and I make it relevant to young people. A greener economy is tackling climate change, which so many young people get and understand and want the action. And I'd say that in government, I nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power, and the Liberal Democrats have the best record of any political party on climate change. And we have really exciting policies, including my Green Economic Recovery Plan, which also feeds into another issue which young people are increasingly worried about, which is jobs. And I'll talk about my Green Economic Recovery Plan, bringing the economy and climate change together and providing a green jobs guarantee for young people worried about where their first job will be. And I'll talk about a fairer society, and I'll particularly focus in on education and housing. I'll say that Liberal Democrats always want to make sure that everyone gets an equal opportunity in education, so they can get the skills and get the training, get the chances, whatever their income background. And we'll compare ourselves with the appalling record of the Tories and point to people like Kirsty Williams, the education minister in Wales, who's Liberal Democrat, is doing a much better job. And I talk about housing for a fairer society too. The fact that there's very little housing that's affordable for many young people. We need to make sure that Liberal Democrats are championing social housing, affordable housing, first-time housing for people. And after the greener economy and the fairer society, I talk about the more caring country. And I look to COVID and show, look, in COVID, so many people have had really bad times, and look at the mental health problems that young people are facing under COVID. Liberal Democrats have championed the cause of investment in mental health. Look at what we did in government with Norman Lamb. Look at our policies where we're the only party saying we're prepared to put income tax up by a penny in the pound, with a lot of the investment going to mental health. And then I talk about caring, and Catherine, we talked about this. I was a young carer when in my early years. My dad died when I was 4. My mum became terminally ill when I was 12, and I nursed her for 3 years. And I think that experience as a young carer at that particular age, there's going to be a lot of empathy with people who have had those caring experiences. And I think young people often have had those, or know people who've had them, and they want to know that the government and the party they're talking about actually cares about them. And I think, you know, Liberal Democrats have a strong record on caring. I want to be the voice of carers. So that's how I'd tell the party, Catherine: a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. And I think that resonates with the priorities of young people.
Thank you. Catherine, do you feel resonated with?
Mostly. I would come back and say, even my grandmother, her time in the Young Liberals, she referred to it as being leaflet fodder. And that's definitely how a lot of us feel. So can I just quickly ask, how many young people are on your campaign teams?
And I'd like 30-second answers, please.
A lot. I can't give you an exact figure. We've got about 2 or 3 in the core team, and then in the wider team, we've got, I don't know, 10, 20. Lots.
Thank you, Ed. Leila?
The vast majority of my campaign actually are under 30s, and even in my own local party, we have a reserved spot for the OULD group locally to always have a space around our campaign tables.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd like to call in Deepa Vaya.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm from the Racial Diversity Campaign. My question is, how will you ensure that diverse candidates standing for election will be given the support they need to finance their campaign and have the moral support?
Leila?
This is really, really important right now. We've had this general election review. It has again exposed the issues with electing diverse candidates and also reaching out to diverse voters. And this has to be a top priority for me as leader, and it will be. And we need to put our money where our mouth is, bluntly. I myself am a product of when the party has taken this seriously, then directing resources towards people like me who are from diverse backgrounds. You know, I'm a woman, I'm LGBT, I'm half Palestinian, I tick a lot of these boxes. But I also suffer all the time, including now, I'll be perfectly honest, with imposter syndrome, with feeling like, oh, who am I going to be looking up to for, you know, that advice and guidance? There aren't very many people like me. And when I go into even the Houses of Parliament, you recognize that you are breaking glass ceilings all over the place. And you're right, Deepa, to point out that it's not just money, it's also the moral support. So in my own journey, I've recognized that this has been a journey for myself, that I've been helped by others, and I then go on to help others. I purposefully go out of the way to, when there are diverse candidates who need help with selection, I will give them my campaign materials, I'll give them my time. I've set myself up as a mentor. I used to be the co-chair of the Parliamentary Candidates Association. When I did that, I did a study of the general election candidates in that year after the 2010 election, where we looked at how much it cost to be a candidate. And it was called the real cost of running. And it was atrocious, because what it made us realize was that you have to have in your back pocket either a job that allows you that level of flexibility or family wealth, because the average amount that it was costing candidates, even in seats that we couldn't win, was well above hundreds of pounds. I think the lowest amount was in the hundreds of pounds. And there were some candidates who were spending thousands. In fact, there was one who remortgaged their house and then did not win. So that's where the money has to come in. You have to be able to support those candidates with real money, and I would fundraise towards it and have specific pots that would go towards diverse candidates getting elected.
Thank you. Ed?
Hi, Deepa. I've already been working with Daisy Cooper, the MP for St Albans, on ideas that would help this. We think there needs to be a new fund to help all candidates, particularly in target seats, and particularly from diverse backgrounds, so we can massively improve on our diversity record, which is frankly shameful. So we'll need to fundraise, and we'll need to fundraise dedicated to begin with for the target seats, so we can get more diverse candidates in the seats so they can actually win and represent us in Parliament and in target councils. So money absolutely is key, and we've been developing plans to do that. But it's not the only thing, in my view, Deepa. I think we need to do much more than that. If you read the Older Dice Review, published in January 2018, you look at the General Election Review, we've got to go further still. We've got to encourage local parties to change their culture. And both Leila and I have talked about introducing the Rooney Rule. So we have every shortlist must have a candidate from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. We want to campaign to change the law so we can have BME only shortlists, which you can't at the moment under current legislation. I want to go further still. In my first few days as leader, I would write to every target seat, every target council, and ask them specifically what are their plans to ensure proper racial equality in their selection process to go beyond the Rooney Law. So the leader has to play a role in this. I like to think my track record in my constituency shows my determination. I represent one of the most diverse constituencies of any Liberal Democrat MP. We've got a large Tamil population from Sri Lanka, Gujarati population from Northwest India, Muslim population mainly from Pakistan, but also from Syria, Iraq, Iran, Sikh population from East Africa and Afghanistan. We have one of the largest Korean populations anywhere in Europe. And I've been working with different diverse communities over 20 years, encouraging them to join the party and then become candidates and supporting them as they stood for council and encourage them to go further. So that's my record, and I want, as leader, to go further in all the ways I've described, including fundraising for a special fund to support diverse candidates.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deepa. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you later on again. I'd like to have now Charlie Hasted come in from the LGBT plus LD. I see Charlie turning up.
Hi. Okay, so my question from Plus Lib Dems is, how should we as Liberals respond to attempts to turn minority groups against each other?
I didn't. Someone say that again. I'm afraid I didn't hear it.
How should we as Liberals respond to attempts to turn minority groups against each other? Thank you, Charlie. Shall we just continue, Layla, with starting with you?
If you wish, absolutely. I mean, hello, Charlie. Hello, Plus. As your honorary president, it's lovely to hear your question. And I have to say, the reason behind you asking that question, I think I'm going to preempt and say that we have seen all too often in the last few months this pitting against different minority groups against each other. And it's played out particularly in a phony war that the right in particular have been stoking between saying that somehow it is incompatible to be pro-trans rights and pro-women equality. And to that, I say nonsense. And it has always been nonsense. And I'm so proud of our party that we have never conceded on this ground, that we've called it out for what it is, which is very often a right-wing trope. There is no zero-sum game to be played with equality. If you don't stand up for equality for any minority group, then you are essentially trampling on the rights of all minority groups. And it is important that we as a party are at the forefront of this. What's concerning me, however, is that whilst our party has remained united over it, and whilst, you know, we are absolutely in the right place on this, I think there is a movement now in wider society where some of this is coming under threat. We are seeing Liz Truss, as so-called Equalities Minister, row back on promises on the Gender Recognition Act. And we are seeing the right-wing media, and in fact, often the mainstream media. And how often have I now been on Question Time, on Today, whenever it might be, and it comes up and they ask us about it as Lib Dems because they want to somehow call us out. They say things like, what's your definition of a woman? Well, you know what? I stand up against this, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. We are in the fight of our lives as Liberals against these authoritarians, these people who want to close down minority groups because it's in their interest, because what it does is it stokes their own vote. And it's one of the reasons why I am so passionate about reviving liberalism, about reviving a discourse that is more compassionate, that is kinder, that recognizes that actually it's those minority groups who are far more likely to suffer from discrimination than be so-called perpetrators of anything. We have to be the ones on the right side of this. History will always look back at us and see that we were on the right side of this, as we have been in the past with same-sex marriage, with Section 28, with whatever it might have been. We have always been on the right side of this. And under my leadership, we will continue to be on the right side of this.
Thank you, Layla. Ed.
Charlie, thank you very much for your question. It's really important. And Layla's absolutely right. Our party has stuck together in enduring Hustings, particularly what I remember one on LBC. It was really clear they were trying to divide Layla and myself and trying to find divisions between us, and we were absolutely on the same page. There is actually no opposition between trans rights and women's rights if you understand the inequality that both women and trans people face. And I think one of the ways that we win this argument is trying to gradually educate people about particularly trans men and trans women who face such discrimination, who are amongst the most marginalized people in our society. And I don't think people more broadly recognize the challenges and the harassment, the discrimination that trans people face. And I think the more that you can do that, the more you can actually bring people together who are in some way discriminated against by society. And I think that is a real challenge for people who believe in equality and diversity, like Liberal Democrats, to make sure that the commonality of the challenges and this discrimination that different groups face brings them together, rather than allows the right wing and our opponents, who sometimes are on the left wing, by the way, to split groups and split people against us. And I actually think there is an agenda amongst the, well, let's call them the Dominic Cummings right, for want of a better term, who are deliberately trying to see this attempt to turn the trans agenda against the women's rights agenda, and we must stand firm on it. And that means we must actually reach out to those people in other parties who are standing firm for equality. So Layla's right, the Tory party is split, so's the Labour Party, so's the SNP. And we need to make common cause with people who are fighting the case for equality, because this shouldn't be just a party political issue, even though we are the strongest party on it. So let me name one Conservative, Penny Mordaunt. I think she's been fighting the fight for trans rights very effectively in the Tory party. And we have to admire the fact that she's done that. And one of the people who advises me on this issue, Helen Belcher, is in contact with a cross-party group that is trying to make sure the Gender Recognition Act comes back into play, and the Liz Trusses of this world don't kick it into the long grass. So, you know, we need to make common cause across party to win for equality and win for diversity, and prevent our opponents trying to cause division amongst those people campaigning for diversity.
So could I just, this is a really good time. Charlie, thank you so much for your question. I'd like to just point out how proud I am to be in a party where the both of you have actually been on the same side of this. And I think it's just a wonderful thing for us as Liberal Democrats. So thank you both. And thank you, Charlie, for asking the question that allowed us to showcase that. That's absolutely made my entire evening. I enjoyed that immensely. So our next question comes, I'm going to mispronounce Yo Poon, forgive me, but that's our next question from the Chinese Lib Dems, who's just on his way.
Hello, I'm Yao, and let me just finish up my question. The COVID-19 pandemic and the US campaign against China has raised racist incidences and hate crime against Chinese, East and Southeast Asian people, anyone who looks like Chinese, essentially. A recent YouGov poll in June 2020 showed that 76% of Chinese people in the UK had a racial slur directed at them, compared with an average of just, well, not just, it's still very high, compared with an average of 64% for all BAMB respondents. COVID-19 has also led to increased racism, not just against the Chinese, also against Muslim, Jewish, and other communities. What should be the response of the Lib Dem Party?
Thank you, Layla.
Oh, to be fair on Layla, I should go first a few times.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yao, thank you very much for your question. I think it's a really important one. We've seen BAME communities generally being so badly affected by COVID-19, particularly their health and indeed the mortality. But we've also seen the rise of racism. I think it's particularly with COVID affected the Chinese community, but whether it's Brexit or the general nastiness that you see from parts of the media and parts of the Tory party, it has stoked up a xenophobia, which is deeply illiberal, deeply, I would say, un-British, because we ought to be a country that's tolerant, welcoming, and respects everybody from wherever they come. And so dealing with the Chinese issue, first of all, how appalling this has been turned. We've seen the dreadful things that Donald Trump says almost on a daily basis. And that gets reported, and that feeds and stokes the temperature. And I think, therefore, we need political leaders in this country to speak up about how wrong Donald Trump is. And I fear that Boris Johnson is too weak to do that. We must do that. And given we think Donald Trump's about wrong on almost everything going, it would be right for us to criticize him on the way he's stoked xenophobia. But I also think the police need to take this seriously. These are genuine hate crimes, some of the ones I've heard of, and we need to show that they will be taken seriously by the police. And we need to try to persuade parts of the media to act more responsibly too. So this is a battle that liberals have been fighting over the ages. It comes in new guises, whether it's Brexit, whether it's COVID, and we must stand firm, supporting every community that gets affected, and be willing to speak out, to act, and call on government and the authorities to act to defend people's civil liberties and to act against racism. I cannot underline that enough. We have to champion the Chinese community and every community that suffers under this.
Thank you. Leila.
Well, thank you, Yao, for this question. And it was one that was raised very early on in coronavirus for me, because I'm the constituency MP for Oxford University, or at least parts of Oxford University. And it was Brize Norton, where the expatriated Brits came from Wuhan, and they came here and then went off to go to quarantine from there. And within 24 hours, I was contacted by students who were telling me that as they were walking around Oxford, they were hearing these racial slurs. They were being stopped in the street, they were being shouted at. And at the time, I commented against it, I offered my support. And just a few days later after that, Oxford University, and I'm proud to say they did this, issued a statement saying that they will stand up for them, and it is utterly unacceptable, and that if anyone saw it, whether they are from a community that's being affected by this or not, they should report it to the police, and that we as a community would not stand for this kind of racism. And that is exactly, in my view, that should be the Liberal Democrat response. There is absolutely no place in our society for any kind of racism. But Donald Trump carries it almost as if it's a badge of honor. He calls it the Chinese virus. He does it all the time. He stokes conspiracy theories, and all it does is fuel hate. And this is the modus operandi of the right. This is how they do it. They sow division by making comments like this. That's how he is bolstering his own base. And it has consequences here too, when Boris Johnson, off the back of that trope, then didn't unequivocally condemn Trump. And that was, again, something that I called Boris Johnson out on. It is utterly unacceptable for any kind of racism to exist in our society. What struck me from your question, by the way, is that, as you say, there is no just about 64% of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds having to hear racist slurs as a part of their day-to-day life. And the Black Lives Matter movement has made us all aware, if we weren't already aware before, of just how systemic, how ubiquitous this kind of injustice is in our society. We absolutely have to stand up to it. And it starts by, every time we see it, calling it out, even if we end up being trolled on Twitter, as I very often am. But I'll tell you what, Yao, I do it almost with pride, because if I don't stand up for those groups, then who else is going to stand up for those groups? It has to be our party that's at the forefront of this. Wherever we see racism, we call it out and we try our best to stop it.
Perfect. Thank you both very much. The next question is going to come from Rabina Khan, who represents the Liberal Democrat Lib Dems campaign for race equality. And I think we should totally start with Ed again then this time. Hi, Rabina.
Hi, hello, Geeta. Thank you. Thank you, Leila and Ed. I have to say, you both look really good at the moment on the screen that I'm looking at. So all of you look beautiful. I just wanted to actually, it's something of an important topic because it fundamentally affects many of the young people that I work with. Last week's A-levels fiasco resulted in many young people being disproportionately affected. Ofqual, the exam regulator for England, used an algorithm which meant that 40% of the grades assessed by teachers was downgraded. Private schools benefited, but young people who I know from Black and Asian and ethnic minority communities and disadvantaged communities were treated harshly. And the key word here is algorithm. What would you do about the use of algorithm by this Conservative government that disproportionately affects Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities and disadvantaged communities? Is it the same algorithm that they use in Stop and Search? Is it the same one targeted at the Windrush generation? I don't know, and I'd like some answers around this. What is it? Maybe Layla might know, Ed might know, you've been in government, but I'd like some light on this, particularly in light of the fact this week we will see also the GCSE results coming out.
Yeah, I'd like to just add a bit on that, Rubina, because obviously that's a fantastic question because it's topical. And it would be good to have some leadership from you both on how to feel and think and understand such an immense mass injustice that hurts our children, you know, and you're helpless to prevent it. And I think that that really, really matters.
Well, Rubina, thank you very much for your question. I think we need to be very angry about this on behalf of the young people, on behalf of their families, on behalf of the schools and the teachers. I think a gross injustice has been done, and we need to speak up loudly and clearly for it to be put right. And they knew this was likely to happen. The Royal Statistical Society, the leading statisticians in our country, had, prior to this last few days, last week or two, had warned that the algorithm and the policy that they were implementing would disadvantage people from disadvantaged backgrounds, including Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And rather than the government saying and claiming they are going to level up, they have leveled down. This has hit the more disadvantaged communities the most. And it was within the algorithm, because as I understand it, and I'm no mathematician, Layla may know better as education spokesman and as a mathematician, but as I understand it, they took into account the performance of your school, your institution, in the way they changed the grades that your teacher had assessed you for. And this has made an inbuilt bias for private schools, for independent schools, and an inbuilt bias against schools that were improving. Youngsters who were bright in schools that hadn't got such a good record. So this is a flawed system, which they knew and were told was flawed even before they implemented it. And I think we should be shouting very strongly against it. And, you know, they have this Daily Telegraph argument that if they went with the assessments of the teachers, the central assessed grades, that somehow this would lead to grade inflation. Well, maybe it would. But haven't our young people during COVID suffered enough? They've suffered isolation from their friends. Some will have suffered with mental health problems. They suffer because they haven't had the teaching and the socialization you get in the run-up to exams. So what if one year has slightly inflated grades and a few more people have slightly higher grades? I think that would actually be a fairness, not some sort of thing that was wrong. So I think we should share the anger of these people. We should be on their side, and we should do it for many reasons, but absolutely for reasons of equality and diversity and social justice. This is a moment for us to stand up and be angry and be on the side of these people who, through no fault of their own, are being downgraded.
Thank you. Layla.
So I'll come to the maths of this in a minute, because as you might imagine, I have been getting under the skin of this quite deeply over the last few days. And it's really only been today that I have fully understood, or at least got to a point where I do have a depth of knowledge about this, which has resulted in me being absolutely sure that this algorithm is without a doubt biased. And the reason why it's taken me a few days to get to this position is because I wanted to be sure, because I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to understand it. And having looked at it, and also having looked at Ofpol's own 500-page report that they put out in the last 48 hours, that said they knew, based on their own testing of the algorithm, that a quarter of the grades were going to be wrong. They knew this. And yet when they presented this to ministers, ministers didn't do what they ought to do. And what, by the way, Kirsty Williams has done. So Wales is still using the algorithm, but Kirsty Williams quite rightly recognized that there was an issue when you map individuals onto an algorithm, which itself is not fit for purpose, that there are going to be cases where people start to get downgraded. And so she put in a flaw, which was previous results. And in Wales, because they've got AS levels, and looking forwards towards GCSEs, they also have modular components to a lot of their GCSEs that we don't have in England, then that is the right thing to do. But we don't have that in England. In Scotland, they've moved back to the centre assessed grades, that's the teacher grades. And let me just approach this for a moment with my old teacher hat on. I was a maths and physics teacher for my career outside of politics. I was doing that job for the best part of 13 years. And I used to do this for a living. I used to, in fact, help to run the university admissions part of the school. And what I would always do was, yes, there is an inbuilt bias from teachers. And it's because we want the best for our students. When you predict their grades, what you think to yourself is, what are they going to get on their best day? And yes, they might be a high B right now, but I know if they study extra hard, that maybe on that day they could get an A. And who am I to put any limit on their ambition? And that's how you create predicted grades. And then you check it with your colleagues. And there are checks and balances built into the system as it is now. If that then leads to a small amount of grade inflation, and by the way, when they shout 12%, it's only for A and A star grades. They're not looking at it across the whole piece. They are misleading in the way they are using statistics. Another good example of this is they are saying that 96% of these grades are right within one grade. Within one grade. Within one grade for so many students is the difference between going to their universities or not going at all. What we have here, Rubina, is a case of maths being used to back up the claims of corrupt politicians. And I'm sorry to say the word corrupt like that, but that is exactly what is happening. These people don't know what they're doing. Boris Johnson has put Gavin Williamson in place because he is a loyalist, not because he is competent. And so on Friday, I called for Gavin Williamson to resign. On Sunday, that's today, the front page of the Mirror has Labour joined the Lib Dems in calls to ask Gavin Williamson to resign. We are leading the debate on getting this government to be accountable for the mistakes that it's making. And I will continue to fight for young people, because these are the very people who are going to be affected worst by this recession, whose life chances are being affected by coronavirus more than any generation right now. And we have to be the ones who stand up for them.
Rubina, thank you both for that. The thing is that when you're heading, the thing that annoys me about this, Rubina, and I don't know if your question has been answered by the candidates with this, is that why is it acceptable to go to the lowest common denominator and somehow find that acceptable? Because that's what upsets me. As a mother, why are we going to the lowest common denominator? Why would you not give your child, any child, all our children, the benefit of the doubt? How did you feel, Rubina? Did you feel that this dealt with your questions?
No, indeed. And I think the two words that both Layla and Ed have used, removing bias, which Layla used, and social injustice, which Ed used, they are rightly so in describing this situation. And there was a piece on Sky News where it actually identified that the East End of London had a high number of students whose grades were downgraded. And tragically, places in parts of London where we've got very communities who are from deprived backgrounds who have struggled to move on in education. Those are the communities that have been hit so hard. And I find it tragic because it's incredibly difficult for young people in terms of aspirations.
Yes, you're getting kicked when you're down. And
Yes.
that's unconscionable, actually.
And Geeta, if I may, to answer your question, why have they gone to the lowest common denominator? bluntly, it's because Tories don't trust teachers to be professionals. And ultimately, this is what it has come down to, is that they would much rather rely on statisticians, and not even very good statisticians, because the really good statisticians offered their help and they said, no, thank you, we want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They would rather focus on a equation rather than looking at the individual. And as liberals, if you are faced with a situation, as we have been, where you are looking at the maintenance of a system, maintaining a status quo, the integrity of grades versus the life chances of any one individual child, we should come down on the side of that individual child. That is the right place for us to be as a party. And I'm so disappointed in this government because they still haven't moved. They still can move before Thursday. And I will be doing everything in my power, in my role as education spokesperson, wearing the other hat that I wear on, to make sure that we are holding these people to account.
I mean, Ed, do you think that the government has fulfilled the role of supporting the stakeholder? Because in a way, the stakeholder here are supposed to be our children. So who've we been supporting in creating the results of this algorithm?
No, I think the government have betrayed the children and the young people.
Yes.
And that's why we need to be angry, as what I started my comments about. I think this is a disgrace. And if you look at it, this is a moment where we need to stand up and we need to be on the front foot. You know, I called for Johnson to sack Williamson if he won't resign, because I think he has behaved appallingly. And we need to be clear on a solution to this. And I do think going to the teacher assessed grades is the fairest solution that I can see. It's the quickest solution. And, you know, I think this is a moment for our party to get over the fact that we believe in equality of opportunity, that we stand up for social justice. You know, when Dominic Cummings made his infamous trip to Barnard Castle against the rules that he and his people wrote, I was first out the tracks, and we managed to dominate the TV headlines for nearly 72 hours as I was calling for Dominic Cummings to be sacked. And that got through to people. And it showed that we as a party were not a party that was going to stand by and allow there to be one rule for them and another rule for us. And I think this is a moment where the Tories are vulnerable and we need to go on the attack.
Yes.
I think they have favoured the private schools, favoured the independent schools, favoured their own groups and left everyone else behind. And that is not acceptable. And we should say it loud and clear.
Yes, Robina, thank you very much for the opportunity to have that conversation. So we have the pleasure now of having Hannah Perkin, who's going to be representing Lib Dem women. And she's just on her way. Hi, Hannah.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I have the pleasure of representing Liberal Democrat women this evening. My question is, as leader, how would you work to ensure that local government is a safe, accessible and inclusive environment for women?
Ed, should we start with you again?
Yeah, you say local government. Yeah. Well, we need to make sure that within our own party and with local government generally, that the highest standards are upheld and that there are the complaints procedures, the support procedures and the training available so that if anyone is in any way badly treated, harassed, discriminated against, in any way bullied, that they know how to make a complaint, that complaint is heard properly and they get support. And I think we'll need to work through the local government association, the Lib Dem group there with Howard Sykes and Ruth Dombey. I'm sure they'd be very keen to work with Liberal Democrat women and the next leader to make sure that local government is following the highest possible standards. And I have to confess, Hannah, that I'm not on top of all the different complaints procedures there are, where there is one that applies to every single council at every tier, whether it's town, parish, district, county, unitary, and so on, or whether they each have their own. But whatever the case is, we need to make sure that every single council, whatever the tier, whatever size, is upholding the best practice. We've had to fight very hard within our party. We've had to fight very hard within Parliament to make progress. And it's taken a long time. And, you know, frankly, we need to keep up that fight and be always watchful. But I think in terms of local government, you know, we just need to talk to our friends and our colleagues in local government to make sure we're doing the best possible approach that can be done. Thank you.
Leila.
Well, thank you, Hannah. And this is an issue very, very close to my heart that I have tried within the party to campaign for and support. And I myself actually would not be here were it not for efforts from Lib Dem Women, from the Campaign for Gender Balance. The very first time I got involved in the party was on what they called an Inspiration Day, where we all went to what was then called Conway Street. So that's the old HQ. And I remember we had inspirational talks, and Sarah Tether came along. We were taught what a ward was. I really wasn't political before I got involved in the party. As far as I was concerned, a ward was something that you had in a hospital. I didn't understand it in the context of political campaigning. We even practiced handshakes because women needed to, you know, be more assertive, and a handshake is very often that first impression. And actually all of this stuff, and as trite as it may sound, it really, really matters. And one of the greatest moments of pride for me when I became an MP, having been to a Future Women MPs weekend and sat next to the amazing Lynn Featherstone at a dinner, who was encouraging me to stand and yes, you can do it, and build up from the ground up as she did in Haringey. And then when I went back to to the Future Women MPs weekend as an MP to share and spread that best practice and encouragement and encourage other women in the party. But the point around local government is really well made. The Fawcett Society released data, and I remember this from the general election I was talking about. I think it's only about a third of women in local government are women. 97% of councils are still male dominated. And the Liberal Democrats actually also have a problem with this. I'm very proud that in my own local council group, we won the Vale of Whitehorse District Council. We are more than 50-50, and we've got a woman leader as well as a woman MP. And as a woman MP, I took over from another woman MP, albeit a Tory, and I defeated her. But that itself is a feat. It's very rare that woman follows another woman. It's more likely that there's a single woman that gets elected and then places go, well, that's enough. And then they revert back to type. So there is a whole host of different things that we need to overcome. One of them is support for women in terms of mentoring, in terms of local parties being asked to undergo unconscious bias training. We don't do enough of this kind of training in the party. I myself have been asked as part of selections, well, what if you had kids? As if my male counterparts would ever be asked the same way. I'm sorry to say that in politics, this is still rife. We still have outdated views of how women operate in political spheres. And we need to challenge that in our own party by making sure that these funds are available, by making sure that this mentoring is available, but we need to continue to challenge it in wider society as well.
Thank you both. Hannah, can I ask, when you said that local government should be a safe, accessible and inclusive environment, what were you specifically thinking of as barriers when you asked that question?
In terms of standards committee system, whether the candidates think that as a system that's robust enough to specifically deal with incidences of discrimination within local government. Just wondered whether you had any opinions on that, please. Do
you think that the organisation of the Liberal Democrat is set up to manage that process? Is that what you're asking?
I just want to know really what the opinions are of the candidates on whether they think that's a robust enough system within the party itself, but also in terms of our influence on how that's changed at local government level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those questions got answered. Do you think that, candidates? I think they did answer that really well.
Geeta,
yes.
I would add one thing. You know, I think we do need to check that they are robust, as you say, across local government. But it's this point about representation as well, which Leila was making, which I'd like to underline. You know, any aspect of diversity, unless the minority group is properly represented, or in this case, the majority group with women, unless it's properly represented, guess what? Their voice isn't heard loudly enough. You know, if you read Caroline Criado Perez, Invisible Women book, she is really clear. Unless we get proper representation of women in this case, but it could be Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, could be LGBT+, could be disability. Unless we get proper representation, their issues will not get heard. They will not be tackled enough. And, you know, there may be some progress, but it won't be sustained enough, and it won't be full enough. And that's why, you know, on my council, like Leila's, we've got more than 50% women councillors now. The majority of now are women, which is the first time we've ever achieved that. The leader is a woman, and the majority of the portfolio holders, the senior councillors, are all women. And that has brought a real change. And I've noticed a change in the Parliamentary Party. Now we've got 7 female MPs and 4 male MPs. There's a different atmosphere in the Parliamentary Party to the Parliamentary parties I've previously been a member of. And I really welcome that. I think it's a real advance. And I think unless we not only get the processes right, like the Standards Committee, but improve representation, we will never fully get there.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for that.
Can I just make a brief comment on particularly standards committees, but also why often these appeals processes are a problem? Because unless you've got representation on those complaints committees, on those standards committees, from the groups and from people who are calling out lived experience that they are perceiving and feeling and experiencing either within the party or in public life, then what you end up having is in local government, you'll have ruling groups essentially marking their own homework. And I've heard from candidates in our own party who have used the complaints process. And by the way, that has been recently revamped, and all credit to some incredible women who have put a huge amount of work into doing this. It needs more resourcing, but there remains a problem where if, for example, you've got someone from a minority group talking about racism or misogyny in the party, they then get to a complaints process, get to a panel, and recognize that the vast majority of people who are sitting on that panel are still middle-aged men. And they feel that their voices are not understood, they're not heard. And so the pipeline, that's why the pipeline is so important. Training will only get us so far. Until you have panels and until you have a change of culture in the party, the very same type of change of culture that the Older Dice Review talks about, but those women in the party will recognize there is a whole other type of culture in the party that also needs to change, more to do with misogyny than anything else. Then unless you have the right people on those panels helping to make those decisions, you aren't going to get the results that you want either.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Hannah, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Hannah.
So we have now Nasser, who is representing the Liberal Democrats Muslim Forum. And on his way.
Right, I think I'm through. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Geeta. Sorry, I was it took a bit of time. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Nasser Bhatt. I am chair of the Liberal Democrat Muslims Forum, and Ed and Leila, the question I'm going to ask you is one that was asked in the recent Hustings with us. We've got a different audience, but the reason why this question has been put forward, that people were somewhat less satisfied. They wanted a bit more specific answer. And also, this is one of the key questions that going forward. So it was important that this question was brought back. COVID-19 highlighted Britain with major weaknesses in public health industry and an unequal society. We rediscovered the BAME society was largely at the front end of social and public care, from healthcare to mental care, from public transport to farmhands, from catering industry to hospitality industry, and reduced to insecure 0 hours employment without any protection. As a consequence, BAME took disproportionate share of suffering and casualties from this disease. Eventually, the public and politicians in the UK realized and acknowledged that these extreme levels of inequality in opportunity and discrimination in the country. So the question really based on that is, can you please list 5 practical policies? This is why the question is being, because they want a bit more specific policies that you would push in the party when you're a leader before the next general election. Can you please list 5 practical policies with loose timeframes that you would be leading on for Liberal Democrats to take to the British people as solutions for these workers on the front line of public services, providing answers to the problems realized by the public in the last 6 months?
Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to have a crack. As I understand it, because I wasn't quite able to hear the question, so Nasser, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you were arguing and asking for 5 practical policies that the Liberal Democrats could push forward to help Black and Asian minority ethnic communities who are in these different sectors that have been so badly affected by COVID, whether it's the health or care sectors, whether it's transport, whether it's hospitality. Is that the question? Have I got that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, fine, thank you. Well, first of all, let's start on health and social care. What I'm most concerned about in the health service are reports that health managers were not ensuring that there was fairness in the shift systems in some hospitals, and indeed that Black and Asian minority ethnic healthcare workers were the ones deployed on the front line disproportionately to their numbers in the local workforce. Now, I haven't yet stood those up, but Roderick Lynch, who's the chair of the Liberal Democrat Campaign for Racial Equality, believes he's got information on that, and that needs to be looked into because it's very serious if that were the case. I think more broadly, the health services are a more equal employer than most, but that really stood out as something that would worry me. I think secondly, I'd then look at the care sector, where I think there's a lot more progress that needs to be made, because the care sector, unlike the NHS, is very fragmented. There's private and local authority, there's not-for-profit, there's large care homes, there's small care homes, and there's obviously domiciliary care as well, provided by a whole range of private contractors. And I think that's where the biggest problems have been. I think within our hospitals broadly, there's been more PPE than in the care homes, and there's been more testing, and there's been more careful policies. But in the care homes, I think that's where we've seen the gross inequalities, and where, frankly, inequalities existed before. And in care homes in my constituency, the care workers are dominated by people who either are not from this country, they've come on work visas to work here and often help the care home owners with those, or they are from the local Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And the care sector is renowned for low pay, it's renowned for long hours, and that does need to be tackled, and it needs to be tackled with government support, because most of the costs that go into the care homes are linked to wages, and the government has in many ways tried to keep its costs down by not sorting out the wage inequality. And so I would want us to argue for a principle that care workers we should aim to move them to parity of esteem with similar workers in the National Health Service. I think that would be an ambition which would really go some way to improving things. I think in the other sectors, I think there are 2 or 3 areas that we need to look at the most. The first is the minimum wage legislation, how it is applied and how it is enforced. In my experience, if you pay people properly, you get respect and you get less turnover. So when I was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, I introduced the London Living Wage. I had a battle with my civil servants, a battle with the Tories, but it took me a year, but I got it in. And that wasn't affecting the civil servants, but it was affecting the catering staff, the security staff, and the cleaning staff, who were all on lower wages than the London living wage, and they kept turning over staff. So it was actually not great for the service, and it was not good for them and their families. They were suffering because they were on lower pay. And therefore, I think increasing the pay in those sectors would be a very good thing for us to campaign on through the London living wage. On transport, I'm not an expert. One have to work with the Transport for London in London and other transport authorities. The way I think you could do it is working with people like Caroline Pidgeon, who is our excellent assembly member on London and in London, and I think we could bring it into the campaign in London and indeed potentially in other parts of the country where there are transport authorities that are elected. So I'm not sure if that's 5 policies, NASA, but I've been talking for a long time. So I'll pass up to Layla, because I'm sure she's got some policies to offer you.
Yes, thank you very much, NASA, question. And so 5, 1 in the past. So one of the things that was brought to my attention very early on in coronavirus was obviously the fact that there were people putting themselves on the front line. And I was contacted by one of my constituents, a radiographer in Oxford, anonymously, who said, I'm really worried about my 9-year-old daughter. My wife is also an NHS worker. If I go to work and I catch and die from coronavirus and the same happens to my wife, what happens to my child? Where is any financial stability for her? Is there not a scheme of some sort, like in the army, where if you pass away in the line of duty, then you get money? And of course, it will never replace those people who have passed away. And it's a horrible thing almost to have to campaign on. I basically did it almost without the party branding behind it, because I felt that it was such a non-party political issue. It was just the right thing to do. But what I did do is I pulled together a coalition of MPs from across the House, including many backbench Conservative MPs. Some of them, you'd be surprised by some of the names, very right-wing. And we wrote a letter to Boris Johnson, and we started to get coverage for this. We started a petition, but then I got contacted by the Daily Express newspaper, who took on this call for a coronavirus compensation scheme, and it was eventually delivered. And it's how you get stuff done from the position that we are now, because it's just the right thing to do. And disproportionately, as we know, it has been Black, Asian, and minority ethnic nurses and doctors who have been putting their lives on the front line. And if they pass away, they deserve that money. There is a real concern at the moment that they aren't getting, all of them, the money that they need. And it was when I interviewed the chief of the British Medical Association. I'm running the inquiry into coronavirus, the cross-party inquiry right now. Every week we are taking evidence. Last week I was away, so Munira did it. So we've got good Lib Dem representation on there. And what we discovered in our very first evidence session was that it is some racist policies in the NHS that have partly led to this. And we were told of stories where there are people who have beards, and it's part of their culture and it's part of their being to have them, and they were asked to either shave the beards off so that they could wear the masks properly, or to stand aside, or given the option to just wear it more loosely. Well, when you are on the front line fighting coronavirus, that should not be allowed. We were not equipped for the right protective equipment for all of our medical staff. And that is a scandal, and one that we are pursuing as part of the inquiry. But separate to that, and those are 2. So coronavirus compensation scheme, making sure that we've got the right protective equipment for the front line. The third, frankly, is that we need to be paying our doctors and nurses better. We absolutely need to make sure that they are being paid well, but we also need to protect those who are in those industries that are going to be and continue to be affected by coronavirus. So in particular, leisure, and in particular hospitality. And we know that it is women, it is young people, and it's Black and minority ethnic workers who are affected the most. We have to continue the furlough scheme. And one of the policies that I've been talking about in this leadership election is a universal basic income, because when we are seeing that whole sectors are going to be changing as a result of this 1 in 300-year recession, we have to make sure that no one falls through the cracks. And so introducing something and campaigning on a universal basic income shows people that we understand that there are people right there on the breadline, and that will disproportionately help those who are in those more vulnerable positions. And the last thing, and again, I've lost track and I'm not sure if this is 5, it's probably close, is I have been campaigning for changes to the school curriculum. We have to, in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, but actually more generally, as a nation, understand our own history. This is not about rewriting history. It's quite the opposite. It's actually about revealing, showing ourselves who we actually are, understanding how society was built off the backs of slaves in some cases, or more importantly, to celebrate the achievements of the Windrush generation and how they came to this country to help us rebuild after great catastrophes. We have to understand our own history as a country. And so again, cross-party, I have been working to campaign to change our country's curriculum so that we can ensure that we understand the way that our society is built, to celebrate it in the ways it should be celebrated, but to also ensure that we are calling out that endemic systematic racism that we've been talking about in so many questions today. It exists in all parts of society. If we only understood it better, then we could stop it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you, for going to such depth with regards to this. And Nasa, it was a really fantastic question and incredibly topical. So it really, really mattered. I'd like now to go to some lady who's been waiting very patiently. Juliet Macpila is talking on behalf of the Liberal Democrat Black Action Committee. Hi, Juliet. We just need you to unmute, Juliet. Perfect.
First of all, thank you so much for getting us to ask a question. I'm Juliet Macapila, and on behalf of the Lib Dem Black Action Group / Committee, our question is, Africans seeking short-term visas in the UK. I'll repeat. Africans seeking short-term visas in the UK are more than twice as likely to be refused than other applicants' visas. Sorry, I'll start again.
No, that was good, Juliet. You don't need to start again. That was perfect. Keep going.
Okay, so Africans seeking short-term visas in the UK are more than twice as likely to be refused than other applicants. Bias and discrimination are evident against Black people throughout the immigration application process. Would you overhaul the current immigration system and make it fairer and more compassionate to ensure the Windrush scandal with all its subsequent family anxiety and pain, and so that it never happens again? Thank you. And best wishes to both MPs.
Thank you, Juliet. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to take that. Juliet, thank you so much for the question. You know, I do an awful lot of casework for different groups applying for visas and other documents from the Home Office. And I'm working in this area for 20 years. And you're absolutely right. There is discrimination, and I think it is worse against people from different African countries. I don't have a huge African community in my constituency. They're mainly from Zimbabwe, a number from Uganda, a number from Somalia, and a few from Sudan. So I've got some experience working on their cases. And I particularly think of a lady who was originally from Uganda, then went to Kenya, was actually a modern slave by an Arab family living in London. And I had to sort out her very complex case. It took me about 3 years to solve. But it was really clear that the Home Office were not sympathetic at all. And I've had example after example of I can't say it's racism, but one feels that there was not the support there, despite the evidence being pretty clear. So I do think we need to overhaul the Home Office. I would like to dramatically change the Home Office because I think it has too much power. And I think some of the visas, whether they're for students, whether they're for work visas, whether they're for asylum, should go to different departments who've got more knowledge of Britain's needs and of those areas. So, you know, I do agree we need to overhaul. And one particular thing I'd raise with visas has been the increasing cost of visas and the way the Home Office has frankly milked people who've got no money and are very vulnerable, often putting them into positions of debt. And I've got case after case of people who are being charged, you know, hundreds, in case one or two cases, we've got a number of family members, thousands of pounds for their visa applications with no guarantee that they'll be successful. And even if they get a short-term visa for, say, 2 or 3 years, a spousal visa, then they may have to then reapply and get charged a fee again. And this is just so unfair, charging these extortionate fees to people who, frankly, are coming to our country wanting to contribute and often escaping horrendous situations. So I would want not just to overhaul the system in the Home Office, but overall the fee system, which I think is so unfair.
Thank you. Layla.
Well, this is absolutely unfair. And like Ed, I mean, my hatred of the Home Office is primarily linked to my work as a constituency MP. The calls that I will get from some of my caseworkers, sometimes in the middle of the night. I used to have a detention centre in Kidlington in this area, which thankfully has now closed down. We spent years campaigning against it to get it shut down. And I would take their cases, unlike, by the way, the Conservative MP who served before me, who refused to take their cases and said that the MP who would take their case was the MP for whom they were first in the country. So that's either the MP at one of the ports or the MP at one of the airports. And I thought this was absolutely wrong. If someone needs my help and they are in my area, it is my duty to help them. And it's through those cases that I've seen for myself that what you say, Juliet, is absolutely right. There is a hostile environment in the Home Office. It has got worse and worse and worse, and it needs completely overhauling. And it was put there by Theresa May under the behest of people like Cameron and under Kerry Don, and it actually took for Amber Rudd to leave and apologise over Windrush for people to start to see some of the issues here. But as far as I can see, nothing has really changed. And now we have an even more right-wing Prime Minister and an even more right-wing government. And the right thing for us to do as a party is to challenge this at every step of the way. Whenever we are seeing these kinds of injustices, to make sure that there are impact assessments that are done against Priti Patel's ideas about who's going to get to come into the country, where we see tropes about people who are coming over, who are refugees, who are seeking sanctuary in our country, being called economic migrants. No, they're refugees. They are people who need our help. We need to stand up for them. And the reason we do it is because it is the right thing to do. And where we can challenge the Home Office, we must continue to, whether it be as constituency MPs or through the work that we're doing in Parliament.
Yes, and I agree. And thank you both very much, because it's massively topical. Juliet, thank you again for your question and your time. It was a fantastic question. We have the young, deeply competent Catherine Macy back with us from the Young Liberals, who has a question.
Competent, not sure about that.
Very competent.
So this question, as a carer, obviously I have experience with my disabled mother, my disabled brother, my disabled grandmother, and I'm also disabled myself. I have autism. So there's been a lot going on around disabilities. As the Alderdice Review pointed out, we need to be doing better as a party. And unfortunately, a lot of the ways we voted in coalition, be it right or wrong, a lot of those heavily impacted the disabled community, which is a very widespread community. So as young Liberals, we would really like to know, and as the diversity officer, how can we build back trust with people who have disabilities?
Well, can I take this?
Please,
I
please
mean,
do.
so your story and what you've just said reminds me of when I was very first selected into Oxford Western Abingdon. It was 2012, and so this will have been early part of 2013. And I remember, it might have been a bit later, but nevertheless, and it stays with me as a story. A lady comes to the door and she's in a wheelchair, an electric wheelchair. She's clearly very disabled and has been for some time. And we start chatting, and it's a council house in Abingdon. And she starts crying. And I ask her what's wrong. And she says, just wait there. And she goes into her living room, and I'm waiting outside, and I remember it was raining. And she brought back this letter, and it was a letter from the council that had told her that she needed to either stump up money or move from her council flat because she had 2 bedrooms, and the bedroom tax meant that she had got this letter, and she just did not know what to do. And I sat with her on her doorstep as she cried. And I said, I will do everything in my power to try and help you. And we lobbied the council and all the rest of it. And the reason why she had that small second bedroom was because her son would occasionally come and care for her and stay overnight when whatever she had, and we didn't discuss her medical condition, but whenever it got too bad, she had somewhere for someone to come and stay. And it wasn't because, you know, this was and it wasn't an obvious place where she could go. They ended up, by the way, I have to say, asking her to move, and it was a Tory council at the time. But it's those kinds of policies that I expect you're talking about. And it's wrong. And it was wrong. And it was the wrong policy for any government. But the fact that we were part of that government that made policies like that, I think we need to accept that because of those stories, because of the thousands of people who were affected by that kind of thing, we did lose trust. And that's what we need to build back now. We have to absolutely win it back. Because if we are going to be the people who champion against inequality, who are the people who are going to fight austerity, how can we do that? If you look back at the last general election, whenever Joe tried to do that, people would then point to that coalition record and say, you are a hypocrite. And the way to get move on from it, and that's all I want to do. You can't rewrite the past. If I'm leader, I will be asked those questions as well. But what I can do is say that we understood that we made those mistakes, that they will not happen again, and that when we are talking about these issues now, we will absolutely cast iron guarantee not sacrifice those basic principles of liberalism to be free from ignorance, poverty, and conformity in order to have a 5p plastic bag tax or whatever it is that we are then going to say was the positive bit. I'm sorry, they do not equate. And we have to appreciate what this has done to our party, and that now is the moment that we can have an opportunity to show people that we are moving on to start building that trust again and listen to their concerns and be on their side.
Thank you, Leila. Ed.
Catherine, one of the 3 themes of my leadership campaign is that we need to be the voice of carers. We need to be the champion for a caring country. And that desire, that push from me comes from both my political experience as a constituency MP, helping many disabled people over the years with their benefits, but also with housing, winning campaigns to get more access to local public transport, particularly railway stations, whole set of issues that I've worked in my own area over many years with the communities representing disabled people to make sure that we are championing them. But also my personal life. I was a young carer, obviously not the same circumstances as you, but caring for my mother for 3 years when she was terminally ill, and then caring for my grandmother when she was very frail elderly. I was basically her main, in charge of her caring for a decade, and now caring for my disabled son who can't walk or talk and has profound learning disabilities and needs 24/7 care. And that personal experience, allied to my experience helping my constituents, convinces me that people who need care, whether it's physical disabilities, mental health problems, learning disabilities, people who've been bereaved, a whole range of people are not getting the care that they should have. And I think this is a massive issue. And yes, there were issues in the coalition. We need to show empathy with them. And I can tell you, I can show empathy with them because I know about caring and disability. But we've got to show them that we've got a policy for the future. We've got to talk about the future, not just the past. And my campaign is about the future. And it's about being the voice of carers, improving carers allowance, bringing a universal basic income, which will be the best move for carers. If you go back to what I was talking about with Caroline Criado Perez in the Invisible Woman book, one of her key themes is the fact that women do most of the unpaid caring in our society, whether it's for children, whether it's for elderly relatives, whether it's for disabled relatives. And you know, if we had a universal basic income, we'd be rewarding all that unpaid caring, and that I think would dramatically improve the lives of carers and the people they're caring for. And I think it would be a huge step forward for equality for women. And I want to be really radical on the disability agenda going forward. And if we really tackle the caring challenge, do you know what? We change the way you organize GDP. Now, we've talked in this campaign about well-being and having different measures of economic progress to take about well-being. But do you know that GDP, when it was constructed after the Second World War, was a masculine construct, which didn't take account of women's work? And you know, they've done some estimates that if they included the value of unpaid caring in GDP, many of the Western economies, including Britain's, the GDP would go up by 50%. So let's be really radical on this. Let's show that we understand caring in all its forms. And you know, if we did, we would completely change the lot of people with disabilities and their carers and their families.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Catherine, thank you so much for that question, and both of you, because I do think that part of the conversation we've had tonight has been about taking and improving the lot of the most basic of us in life and the most vulnerable of us and pushing that upwards, which then automatically trickles up into society. And I'm very proud of both of you and of Catherine, who is deeply competent, apparently, for those questions. Thank you. We have one last question, and this one will be from Rabina, who you've met once before, from the Liberal Democrat Campaign for Race Equality. This is our last question, so a little bit of distinctness would be massively appreciated. Rabina.
Oh, thank you, Geeta. Well, I hope so. Taking back control is a lot harder than writing a slogan. And that was the words that I used when I quoted Lord Oates in my last week's article on refugees. Do you think that Priti Patel was right and the government was right in calling in the Navy to address vulnerable people? Have we put them in a difficult position? It's a very simple question.
Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, she was totally wrong. It was an outrageous suggestion. The idea that you treat people who are traveling on very rickety vessels, dinghies, because they are escaping potentially persecution, discrimination, violence, imprisonment, torture, you put the Navy on them. It's just unconscionable.
Yes.
And, you know, we should, and I believe Christine Jardine, our excellent Home Affairs spokesperson, has been strong in condemning that. Priti Patel is one of the most outrageous ministers in this government, one of the worst Home Secretaries that I've ever seen, and there's been some pretty poor ones. And her attitude to immigration, her attitude to immigrants, her attitude to asylum seekers is quite simply wrong. And we should champion a fair immigration system that recognizes the human rights of people. As liberals, we should have equal respect for people wherever they come from, wherever they live in the world. You know, I'm getting a bit lyrical now, but if you go back to Gladstone, William Ewart Gladstone, the 19th century Midlothian campaign, his 6-hour speech, I won't quote it, but his 6-hour speech, he talks about the shepherd in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan being equal in the eyes of God. He brought God into it. We don't have to bring God into it. But he was basically making the point. The liberals believe in equality, and that applies to everybody. And the idea we bring in the Navy for these people who are very, very vulnerable is beyond the pale, and we should call her out.
Thank you so much, Ed. Layla, we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, of course it's wrong. Of course it's wrong. This is a humanitarian issue. This is not a military issue. These are people who desperately need our compassion and love. And I say this as my mother's family were frankly refugees. You don't leave your country of origin lightly with nothing on your back and then go and try and make another life elsewhere. You don't do that lightly, and it's fraught. And you're leaving family behind. You don't know necessarily what you're going to. I think it's only 1% of the world's refugees are in our country. And yet, if you look at how, you know, even the media, when they're filming them crossing, it's like a wildlife documentary rather than a documentary about people and their extraordinary stories. And I do think that we as liberals should be standing up for that humanitarian side. These are people just like us who happened to have been born somewhere else under different circumstances. And when we are attacked by the far right, and Priti Patel wants to bolster her own base and sound off these tropes because she thinks it's good for her politically, I will never play that game. I will always call her and people like her out because it's the right thing to do. It's the liberal thing to do.
Thank you so much. Yay, look at that. He came in, he's like, where's my mother? Rabina, thank you so much. And I would like to honestly, deeply thank you very, very much, both of you, Layla and Ed, for being here this evening and for taking a vast variety of questions. Just a little bit in closing. So tonight, 6 out of 8 delegates tonight were women. 5 out of 8 of the delegates were from ethnic minorities. But obviously there is still, as we know, so much more to do. And these are topics that we're going to continue to debate once a new leader is in place. I'd like to thank the many people that actually put this together, if you would give me a minute to do that. So I'd like to thank the following people for supporting this event. Delegates, then their respective organizations, which are the Young Liberals, RDC, LGBT plus LD, Chinese Liberal Democrats, LDCRE, Lib Dem Women, Lib Dem Muslims Forum, and the Lib Dems Black Action Group. I'd also like to thank Liberal Democrat headquarters for the logistical and technical support in hosting the event, in particular the fabulous Jack Coulson. I'd like to thank the West Midlands Diversity and Equality Committee for coordinating the event and its content, specifically the fabulous Nuki Proctor from Coventry Lib Dems, Manuela from the Stratford-upon-Avon Lib Dems, and James from the Southwest Birmingham Lib Dems, and Alec from the Stafford and Stone Liberal Democrats. I'd like to thank all of you at home for all of your engagement and your attention, and thank you for the questions that you sent us. And I would like to wish you both the very, very best of luck. And I know it's been a long, exhausting time for the both of you, and you are both fabulous. We would be honored to have one of you. We will be honored to have one of you as our leader. And thank you for spending the time with us.
Thanks to you, Geeta.
So much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.